So yesterday was the official kickoff of the 2024 election season, and to nobody's surprise, Donald Trump won the state of Iowa pretty handily. That's what the polls were telling us over the past couple months. That's what all the data was really indicating. And we're going to talk about where the other candidates are at this point in the primary, how the rest of the primary is likely to pan out, and then ultimately what the future looks like for the Republican primary going into the next couple months, into the next contest. Because as of right now, it's very clear that Donald Trump is by far and away the favorite and is the leading candidate. And there are a few caveats to that, but for the most part, this is certainly Donald Trump's primary to lose. It always was Donald Trump's primary to lose. Even when DeSantis was polling competitively with Donald Trump back in February of last year, Donald Trump was always, by and large, in the lead. And when you actually went state by state, he was doing a lot better than Ron DeSantis was, even when the national polls were closer. So we're going to take a look at all that in just a second. But first, if you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing down below and liking this video if you enjoy. So Donald Trump won 98 out of Iowa's 99 counties. Johnson County is a one-vote majority for Nikki Haley. As of right now, both candidates getting 35.5% of the vote. But this was the state that Ron DeSantis, I think, is definitely the biggest loser in, because he put all of his eggs in the Iowa basket, and it didn't really yield any results whatsoever. He did barely better than Nikki Haley, and granted, Nikki Haley had a lot more funding, but Ron DeSantis had sort of the conservative, grassroots Ted Cruz sort of ground game, which was very effective. I mean, Ted Cruz back in 2016 won the state of Iowa, and we're going to talk about that a little later, but this was a state where Ron DeSantis had a lot of potential. And, maybe 6-7 months ago, he certainly had a decent shot at winning Iowa and actually propelling himself throughout the rest of the primary. But, at this point in time, months later, when DeSantis' momentum had really just grinded to a halt, it seems pretty hopeless for the DeSantis campaign, I think, going forward. Because you look at the other states, it's Nikki Haley who's doing a lot better than Ron DeSantis in New Hampshire and some of the other contests going forward. So if anyone has more of a chance at the nomination at this point, it's Nikki Haley. Despite the fact that you could argue that she's less conservative than Ron DeSantis, she's just doing a better job, effectively, at getting that more moderate Republican support and even that centrist support in other states where they allow independents to vote in their primaries. So, Nikki Haley is somebody who would be formidable in a general election, but in a primary, she still has a massive uphill battle. And like I said before at the beginning of this video, this is Donald Trump's primary to lose. He's probably going to win the primary by a very large margin. Of course, that was a lot more uncertain after the 2022 midterms, when you had Republicans basically get wiped out in races that they should have won. And, while they still won the House, they underperformed massively in the Senate. They lost a seat in the Senate. And it was a really disappointing result. And it sort of was a rebuke of Donald Trump and the Republicans' messaging on abortion. It was those two factors put together that really propelled the Democrats to halt the red wave and basically turn it into a red puddle, if not just a neutral wave environment in 2022. But going forward, obviously the dynamic is a lot different. You're talking about a presidential election. You're going to have presidential level turnout. You're going to have higher turnout among white working class voters who typically don't vote as much in these midterms. And while that is a massive hindrance to Republicans in off years when they need those victories to sort of solidify their majorities in Congress, that doesn't matter so much in 2024, because this could potentially benefit Republicans down ballot in some key states. Now, the polls in Iowa were pretty accurate. If we take a look at the polling in the Iowa caucuses, Donald Trump had about 52% of the vote. That's essentially what he got on the money. The polls underestimated Ron DeSantis by around 6-7 points. He was at 16% in the polls. He got about 21%, so about 5 points really. Nikki Haley, they underestimated by about 2. She was at 17 in the aggregate, ended up getting 19% of the vote. So Nikki Haley almost got as many votes as Ron DeSantis, and of course Donald Trump got double the votes Ron DeSantis did, and even more so over Nikki Haley. Now, since the Republican caucuses, Vivek Ramaswamy, who's essentially run a Trump-aligned campaign through and through, it really was unclear why he was in the 2024 race to begin with. The only thing I could come up with is that he was trying to boost his own image. I mean, he obviously wasn't playing to win if all he did constantly was praise Donald Trump, never criticize Donald Trump, and he really was just Donald Trump's attack dog the entire time in the primary, and was trying to sort of win over voters that were very MAGA but thought that, Donald Trump potentially could be taken out of the picture via arrest or something like that. So Vivek was sort of their fallback option. But when you run a primary like that, you have almost no chance of actually winning, because who's going to vote for Vivek Ramaswamy when you could just vote for Donald Trump? And that's basically what happened in Iowa. That's why he had such an abysmal showing. And oddly enough, he did overperform his polls by a point. But it was still a terrible showing, and of course, it already proved to many of us what we already knew, that Vivek Ramaswamy was not viable in the Republican primary anyway, and he's since dropped out, and I'm sure he's going to endorse Donald Trump in the coming days. Could even be today. But, you know, that was always going to be the case. You know, Vivek Ramaswamy is just trying to put his name out there, build an image for himself so he could try to build a foundation for a 2028 run. And, of course, for somebody like Ron DeSantis, I really think, you know, 2024 was his year to run either way. Because if you look at 2028, he would have been irrelevant by that point. He would have been out of the governor's mansion for 2 years. So this really was a do-or-die sort of campaign. It was run very poorly. Ron DeSantis could have done a lot better in Iowa and a lot better in the primary overall, and it just wasn't there. The consultants were bad. You know, Ron DeSantis himself had a number of issues. Again, this is somebody who is incredibly smart, incredibly strategic, incredibly policy-oriented, but that doesn't always translate to actual votes when you can't communicate that message effectively. And I think Ron DeSantis had a number of critical and fatal mishaps throughout his campaign, and perhaps we'll talk about it in a later video when we sort of do an autopsy of the DeSantis campaign, because this is somebody who absolutely had a chance at beating Donald Trump in the primary. There's a number of things that happened, both in his control and out of his control, that got in the way of that. But overall, he was somebody who, in a different timeline, with a different campaign and a slightly different set of circumstances, could have easily won this primary against Donald Trump. Well, I shouldn't say easily, because I think it would be a hard-fought battle, but he could have actually put up a fight. Now, it seems like Nikki Haley is on track to be number 2 in the Republican primary. I mean, she's the only one who actually won a county in Iowa. If we go ahead and take a look at the New Hampshire primary, Nikki Haley is at 30%. Ron DeSantis is down at 6%. So what exactly is Ron DeSantis' path from here? Because I really don't think there is one. You know, if you go ahead and look at Nevada, for example, which is the next contest, you have him at about 15%. Donald Trump is at 65% on average, 60%. You know, that's nearly a 50-point lead over Ron DeSantis. It's over in the primary for all intents and purposes. And I said that on Twitter yesterday. And that's been clear for a long time. But now that we actually have official caucus and primary results, there's really no chance for Ron DeSantis to come back. It seems like at this point, Nikki Haley is more viable, obviously, than Ron DeSantis is in some of these states. Because, I mean, if we take a look at South Carolina, for example, well, I guess the Virgin Islands technically has a contest, but there's really no delegates there. If you take a look at South Carolina, interestingly enough, Nikki Haley doesn't actually have a lot of local support. If you take a look at the polls, though, she's still leading Ron DeSantis by 7, 8, in some cases 10 points. Donald Trump's at a solid like 50, 52%. So even in her home state of South Carolina, you know, Nikki Haley is down by 30 points. But, you know, Ron DeSantis is down by even more. So there really is no path for Ron DeSantis. I don't really know what his game plan is. I guess he's hoping for a Hail Mary that Donald Trump gets arrested somehow and taken out of the picture. But I think you're banking on a lot of false hope with that. And I think a lot of presidential primary candidates in the Republican field were also banking on that, and it didn't work out. I think DeSantis is especially guilty of that. And, you know, it's not going to yield any results for him. I mean, going into 2028, what does he really have to tout? He had an impeccable conservative record in Florida. That wasn't enough to win the primary. You know, Ron DeSantis' presidential aspirations are essentially over as of today. And I know there's going to be some people that disagree with me and they look at some of the other future contests. But really, what is the path here? You know, Nikki Haley is somebody who's gathering a lot of the anti-Trump and non-Trump votes. Kristi's out of the picture now. He's endorsed Nikki Haley. A lot of his support is going to go to her. I mean, there was a poll that CNN did not too long ago, a couple days ago, which polled a lot of the Kristi voters to see where their second choice would go. And I think 68% of them said it was going to go to Nikki Haley. Another chunk of that support was going to go to Asa Hutchinson. And I think 1%, or it might have even been 0%, was going to go to Ron DeSantis. I think even Donald Trump had 1% of Kristi's support, and Kristi was running as the fiercely anti-Trump Republican candidate. So again, in a future video, I'll probably break down how the Ron DeSantis campaign really fell apart, where the mishaps were, where the messaging errors were, and ultimately how that sort of just collapsed before us. But going ahead into the future, looking at Donald Trump, for example, you do have the uncertainty of the indictments coming down on him. You know, it's unclear if whether or not he's going to be in custody at some point between now and the convention, or even after the convention. Of course, that would be absolutely insane in terms of the political implications, because of course it's super unprecedented. But it's very clear that in the Republican primary, as I've mentioned before, there really hasn't been any precedent for this whatsoever, that you have the leading candidate on the Republican side facing criminal indictment and being criminally indicted on a number of fronts 4 times now. And there's going to be more, and there's going to be actual trials going on throughout the month of January and going into the future. So we're in very untested waters. The Republican Party is certainly in very untested waters because they're putting all their eggs in the Donald Trump basket. And if something happens to Donald Trump, that's going to be an absolute disaster. And also, if Donald Trump loses the 2024 election, it's going to be a massive rebuke of the Republican Party nationwide, not just on the presidential level, but in local races, congressional, Senate, etc., etc. Now, like I hinted at before, Ron DeSantis could have theoretically won the state of Iowa. If we go back to 2016, Ted Cruz won the state of Iowa. He overperformed his polls by a decent amount. He was at about 23% in the polls back in 2016 in Iowa. He ended up winning Iowa with around 28% of the vote, 27% of the vote. So this was fertile ground for somebody like Ron DeSantis, the grassroots sort of Christian conservative, more evangelical-oriented Republican candidate that we really haven't seen since 2016 because Donald Trump is very far from that sort of candidate. You know, he's very clearly not a very religious person, but he's able to galvanize evangelical voters because of the policies he talks about, not necessarily from the perspective that he's one of them. Ted Cruz was certainly an evangelical. Ron DeSantis is a Catholic, but he certainly fits that sort of Christian conservative mold. Donald Trump is very much not that, but nonetheless, he is most effective at appealing to these voters for a variety of reasons. Now, again, as I mentioned earlier, if you had a lot less support from Nikki Haley, if Ron DeSantis had run a better campaign, he could theoretically have won Iowa. And in the polls going back months and months ago, he was on track to be second place in Iowa and to get very close. And in some cases, very early on, he was leading in Iowa. So there was a small chance that he could have potentially won Iowa way back when. Obviously, over the past couple months, that's been out the window. But Donald Trump is the clear favorite. Again, I would say it's a bit alarming, though. He's only garnered 51% of the Republican support since he's basically running as an incumbent and as the face of the GOP. Obviously, I think support's going to consolidate as we get into more states. New Hampshire, not so much, but when we go to Nevada, South Carolina, I think he's going to win pretty big there. And I think it's going to be very clear, as it's been for a very long time, you know, that Donald Trump is going to get the most delegates at the Republican convention and likely be the nominee at that point. So, you know, the Republican Party, I think, just needs to come to grips with that because it's very naive, I think, to hold out hope for one of these other candidates if you're one of those Republicans that doesn't want Trump to be the nominee, because at this point in time, it's just not likely or even possible at this point, unless Donald Trump is literally removed from the picture and is not able to run as a Republican anymore. Then you could see a chance for somebody like DeSantis or Haley, but that's very wishful thinking from, you know, an anti-Trump perspective. You know, so Donald Trump is going to be the Republican nominee at this point in time, or at least he's going to get the most delegates. And Republicans are going to have to craft a very effective message against the Democrats and Joe Biden in 2024. And I think for them, their saving grace is that Joe Biden is incredibly unpopular and the left is very divided. And I think if there is a path for Donald Trump to win nationally in 2024, it's going to be because of the fact that the left is so fractured. Joe Biden is such an uninspiring and weak candidate. And while I think Joe Biden is going to overperform expectations, that still might not be enough. Now, again, at this point in time, I've always said I still think at the end of the day, Joe Biden wins the presidential election, if it is going to be by a more narrow result now. But, you know, there's still the possibility that he loses, a very high possibility that he loses because of how bad his polling is. And, you know, other Democrats, for whatever reason, are not tied to Joe Biden. You know, in the 2022 midterms, we saw other Democrats not named Joe Biden do a lot better than Joe Biden would have done. So definitely going to spend a lot of time on this channel talking about 2024 over the next year, obviously. So, of course, stay tuned for that. Please like and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. As always, again, thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.